Thank you very much for the invitation, for the kind invitation. I'm really excited to talk about polarization. I'm going to be speaking specifically about the Canadian context, which is my area of expertise, and pivoting the discussion towards the end about strategies that we can use to depolarize the public and the advantages that might offer. I'm a data guy. I love data, so I have some slides which are all the way over back there. And so if you're interested in following along with some of the data that I present, you can do so back there. And some of this work is also kind of part of a larger research project that I have on polarization that's coming out in a book later this year. So excited to be here to talk about it. So we hear a lot about polarization. A lot of this emerged out of the Trump era, and we've been worried about, how much this travels to Canada. So, all these very hyperbolic headlines that, we've never been more divided, that the extremism is on the rise in Canada, that something must be done to avoid the fate of the United States. And it's worth taking a step back to, next slide, to thinking about, well, first, what is polarization? Because polarization is actually a very multidimensional concept. It can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Most simply, it is a state where society is increasingly divided into politically competing camps. And we start to think of ourselves in terms of us and them. I'm in my group, my opponents are in the other group, and that's how society is structured. The nature of those divisions can change society to society. So maybe that polarization is along ethnic lines, maybe it's along religious lines, maybe it's about ideology. The nature of those cleavages can vary context to context and over time as well. And so polarization is a very, very complicated concept, and when we talk about it, we could mean very different things in different time points and in different countries. And the thing, next slide, the thing that I'm most interested in is affective polarization. And this might be what a lot of you think about when you think about polarization. It's polarization in emotions and feelings, that you increasingly don't like the people that you oppose politically, that you are hostile to them. Maybe at the very extreme, you think they're evil and immoral. That's one component of what we call affective polarization, and then the other component is just that you're more warm towards your own party. You have stronger partisan attachments. You like your party more. And the increasing divergence between these things is really important in understanding the health of democracies around the world. Next slide. And how do we measure this concept? Well, public opinion scholars like myself usually use what's called a feeling thermometer. So it's basically a 0 to 100 scale where higher values mean warmer feelings towards certain political objects. Could be parties, could be leaders, could be anything really. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like in Canada over time since 1988. Again, higher values mean more warmth. Next slide. What we've seen is a 13-degree increase in this scale in in-party warmth. So people are feeling more warm towards their own parties. They like them more. It's not necessarily a bad thing on its own, but it's something that we're observing in Canada. Next slide. But more troublingly, we see an even sharper decrease in warmth towards our political opponents, or what's called partisan hostility. Next slide. And on the whole, if we take the difference between these two figures, we see that polarization, as affective polarization in Canada, has increased almost 130% since 1988. And what is that, how do we compare to the US on this? Well, the old adage is that Canada is always 10 years behind the United States, and it really seems that that's the case when it comes to affective polarization as well, that the scores that our survey respondents are showing are, roughly where the US was in 2014, 2012, so on. And why does this matter? Why does this form of polarization matter? Well, there's lots and lots of troubling consequences that emerge from it. For one, there's this notion of partisan bias, and this gets to the psychological consequences of polarization. If you are a polarized individual, You're going to be more likely to seek out information that reinforces your own beliefs. And nowadays, you have more opportunity than ever before to do that. All of this information at your fingertips, on social media, through Google searching and all that. And you're going to seek out information that merely reinforces your beliefs, reinforces your hostility, reinforces your polarization. But also, even when you see information that's inconvenient for your politics, you're going to be much more likely to just reject that information without any sort of deliberation, without thinking about it in any serious way, which is what scholars call motivated reasoning. And so in that psychological context, it's a lot harder to have discussions between people with different political views because they're not reading the same information and they're not willing to seriously consider one another's perspectives. Another downstream consequence of this is that we just don't socialize, we don't form relationships with people that politically disagree with us, that we're going to be less likely to have friends that are political opponents. We're going to be less likely to tolerate them in family settings. And scholars kind of call this political homophily, where we tend to cocoon ourselves in like-minded social networks. And that means that we don't really know our political opponents. We don't know who they are, we don't know what they believe, and that encourages us to kind of form stereotypes and exaggerations about our political opponents. And then two things that I think are probably most troubling is first this notion of politicization, a tendency in really polarized contexts for everything to eventually become political and politically charged. And so we saw some evidence of that in COVID-19. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And even more problematically, the possibility that in a polarized context, we might value democracy less. We might be more willing to tolerate transgressions, to allow candidates to engage in undemocratic actions if it benefits our own team, if it benefits our political position. So, for these latter two phenomena, here's some evidence from Canada. So this is on COVID-19, where in Canada, not as much as the United States, but we still see some evidence of it, we saw partisan polarization on COVID-19. So I'm just going to show you kind of a graph of where the parties stood in the electorate on COVID-19. So what were their beliefs about government restrictions related to the pandemic? Higher values mean they believed in more restrictions. And we see large differences between the Conservatives on the one side and Liberal and NDP supporters on the other. And the interesting thing to note about this data, and we can kind of tease out the longitudinal implications, are that how polarized we were at the start of the pandemic influenced how we behaved in relation to the pandemic. That is, if you were a polarized Conservative who was really, really hostile towards the Liberal Party, towards the NDP, you were less likely to mask, you were less likely to vaccinate. And if you were a polarized Liberal who really doesn't like the Conservatives, you were more likely to mask, more likely to vaccinate. So affective polarization produced polarized outcomes among Canadians on COVID-19, compromising our ability to effectively respond to the pandemic. But even worse is the possibility that we might eventually tolerate support for anti-democratic actions. And the reason for that is if you're a polarized individual, that you really, really don't like your political opponents, you see them as a threat. You see their worldviews as threatening to yourself, to your team. And, thinking about motivated reasoning and this, partisan bias that I talked about, it's just really easy to excuse anti-democratic actions from your own side. And so what we do see in the data is that people are much more likely to tolerate these deviations from democratic norms when their own team's doing it. And this is especially true among people that are much more polarized and hostile. So here's an example of this. So turns out that 42% of people would be totally fine with a prime minister of their party failing to resign after an election defeat if they claim there are election regularities, kind of drawing inspiration from election denialism in the United States. But that drops to 18% of people when it's their political opponents refusing to resign after an election defeat. And if you're polarized, that hypocrisy, that democratic norm hypocrisy, is much stronger. 64% of people who are polarized would support a prime minister refusing to resign after an election defeat. And so what affective polarization does to us, as that tribalism grows and grows in society, is it makes us much more tolerant of deviations from democratic norms if it's our team that benefits from those deviations. And we see that happening before our eyes in the United States right now. So, I came to talk about solutions. Normally, I identify the problems and not as much about the solutions, and that's how a lot of us political scientists function, unfortunately. But there's a lot of strategies that we've identified that show promise, and one of the things that kind of underlines all of them is that we need to kind of recognize our common bonds. That we need to understand that actually our political opponents are not kind of these caricatures that we think about, but they're real people, very similar to ourselves, that just have different views about politics. One kind of observable fact that we see in Canada, in the United States, and in other countries is that all of us think we are much more polarized than we are. There's this awkward tension. I'm coming here talking about how we're polarizing, but actually it's not as bad as we think it is. That we are not nearly as strongly polarized. And there's a lot of good evidence that suggests that if you correct people's beliefs about this, if you give them accurate information that, hey, your political opponents aren't extremists, your political opponents are very much like yourselves, it makes people warmer. Makes people more warm towards their political opponents. If we get people to think about the friendships that they have, the social relations that they have with people that disagree with them, that also makes people more warm towards their political opponents. So these sorts of interventions matter quite a bit, and it all kind of feeds into this third thing, and that's having political discussion with people that disagree with us. There's a lot of advocacy organizations out there that are trying to implement this at scale, to get people into a room and to talk with one another about politics. And there's potentially a lot of advantages to that. We have a lot of good evidence that suggests that talking about politics actually makes people feel more warmly towards those that disagree with them. But there are some caveats here that are worth noting, that if you talk about really hot-button topics in these cross-partisan discussion groups, it could actually make people more polarized. So it's a solution that is a bit fraught, that we have to be very careful about how we implement those sorts of interventions in an effort to depolarize the electorate. But a lot of this kind of all flows through the notion of empathy, that if we encourage people to engage in what we call perspective taking, kind of putting yourselves in the shoes of people that disagree with you, that people become less polarized, they become less hostile. So all of these strategies work to some degree. The challenge is that how do you implement them at scale? And how do you implement them in contexts where the whole system is just intensely polarizing? And that's why we tend to put too much onus on individuals for solving polarization. That too often the narrative is, well, we just can't have discussions anymore. It's all the fault of individuals. We have to think much more carefully about how institutions play a role in this, how elites play a role in this. Elites, I mean politicians, thought leaders, and so on. Because ultimately, polarization is structural. It varies country to country in ways that are related to their institutions. So we want to think about things like campaign finance rules. That we have a system of campaign finance rules in Canada that are focused on the parties having to raise these enormous sums of money from individual donors. And individual donors tend to be more ideological, more polarized, more affectively polarized. And that changes the incentives that politicians have to be more inflammatory in their rhetoric and their behavior. So thinking about those incentives that politicians face is really important, because ultimately polarization is a story of politicians and parties and elites in society, and so we have to think about those things more carefully. We also have to consider the media environment as well. In Canada, like in many other countries, we've seen the death of local news and the never-ending struggle of mainstream news outlets to stay alive. And the result of that is people increasingly get a diet of information from national news, from polarizing sources of information rather than local news. And it encourages journalists to, in order to get clicks, get likes, get shares, they really kind of amp up how polarized our parties are, how polarized politics has become. That sensationalism kind of undergirds a lot of political reporting. So we need to bring more stability to the media sector, and that can help as well. But, another thing to note is that solving polarization might not be exactly what we want to do. If the consequence that we're worried about is that polarization could undermine democracy, we have to also think of ways to bolster resistance among the public to democratic norm erosion. A big part of the problem we're seeing in the United States and in other countries of democratic backsliding is that people aren't able to connect broad democratic principles to specific actions taken by politicians that undermine the foundations of democracy. And so finding ways to build that democratic resilience in the mass public is very, very important for the health of democracy moving forward. And I want to end on a note of caution. We think about polarization as a bad thing entirely, that it's just all bad, polarization's all bad. But there are benefits to polarization, and some forms of polarization aren't all that bad and actually might be beneficial. So there's a tendency to say, we want to depolarize. Everybody should become less polarized. But it actually is a good thing if parties stand for different policies, stand for different principles, offer clear alternatives to voters that can be acted upon. That form of polarization can be a good thing. Polarization can also be mobilizing. The stakes of political conflict increase, and so it can encourage people to turn out, to sign petitions, to protest, to do things that are helpful for the foundations of democracy, encouraging an engaged citizenship. So there's all these benefits that polarization can provide. So if we are going to, bridge divides and depolarize and all this, we have to be cognizant of that fact, that we don't want interventions that can actually turn more and more of the general public apathetic about politics. We have to keep that in mind. And then finally, it's tricky to talk about polarization in contexts where there is democratic backsliding. A lot of the countries that are the most affectively polarized are affectively polarized for a reason, because we have one side that's systematically attacking the foundations of democracy and another side that is just trying to hang on. That's true in Turkey, it's true in Hungary, and it's increasingly true in the United States. And so, thinking about depolarization and efforts to make people nicer to one another, normatively we understand that is a good thing in a lot of cases, but it is weird to talk about depolarization in those terms to people that are losing their rights and their liberties. That polarization for them can allow them to protect themselves, to protect their rights, to protect democracy. So we need to keep those kind of normative gray areas in mind when we talk about polarization, because it's really, really important moving forward. So that's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Hello, thank you for sharing the information. I just have a question for you, just a point of clarity. When you were talking about news, like the media, I understood, and maybe it was perhaps my misunderstanding, that you classify independent media as extremism. Was that correct in my understanding?
No. There's lots of different types of media outlets out there. Some cater to partisan and ideological audiences, but not all independent media do that. My point on that was that simply that we have a lot more choice about the news that we consume because of social media, because of our easy access to information, and so we tend to pick news that reinforces our beliefs, and so a lot of people gravitate towards outlets that are partisan or ideological and kind of wear that perspective on their sleeve. But that doesn't apply to all independent media outlets.
Thank you. My name is Arif from Bangladesh. Thank you, the session was pretty good. So, quick question you mentioned about if the political belief is for a certain group, people are tend to, even support if the idea is not democratized, right? So, do you see that this trend in any specific demographics or age group or any certain areas where this spikes more? Number one, and any quick suggestion how to tackle those kind of things to make everyone better towards the open and liberal ideas.
So the first question is, were there any people specifically that are more likely to tolerate democratic norm violations? It maps on very closely to who are the most polarized individuals in society. And folks that are polarized tend to be more knowledgeable about politics. They tend to be older, more established. They don't like, and then the reverse is the opposite, that younger people don't find a home in Canada's political parties nearly as much, and so they don't exhibit these sorts of trends. So it tends to map onto, who are the most likely to be really strongly engaged in partisan politics in the country, and that kind of mirrors general patterns of political participation, higher socioeconomic status, older, that sort of thing. So, and your second question was?
Any thoughts on how to tackle those kind of issues, right?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and it's tough because it does seem like there is an informational problem in the sense that people just can't identify norm violations if it's in front of them, because they're not able to connect those things to broader principles. And so that might be a failure of education. Like, it might be a failure of education really early on that we need to correct, civics education and all that, greater socialization, appreciation for democracy. The problem that we have is that democracy is taken for granted and we don't really talk about it as much as we should. And so it kind of leaves this informational vacuum that can be exploited by people that want to undermine its foundations. So maybe there's an element there that I think is important, but there's no easy fix for sure.